On this board, thirsty strangers deposited their cups as they stood in the road and drank, and threw the dregs on the dusty ground to the pattern of Polynesia, and wished they could have a restful seat inside. Thus, the strangers. But there were also local customers who felt the same wish, and where there's a will, there's a way. In a large bedroom upstairs, the window of which was thickly curtained with a grate lately discarded by the landlady, Mrs. Rolliver, were gathered on this evening nearly a dozen persons, all seeking vinous bliss. All old inhabitants of the nearer end of Marlow, and frequenters of this retreat. Not only did the distance to the pure drop, the fully licensed tavern at the further part of the dispersed village, render its accommodation practically unavailable for dwellers at this end, but the far more serious question, the quality of the liquor, confirmed the prevalent opinion that it was better to drink with Rolliver in a corner of the housetop than with the other landlord in a wide house. A gaunt four-post bedstead, which stood in the room, afforded sitting space for several persons gathered around three of its sides. A couple more men had elevated themselves on a chest of drawers. Another rested on the oak-carved quover, two on the washstand, another on the stool, and thus all were somehow seated at their ease. The stage of mental comfort to which they had arrived at this hour was one wherein their souls expanded beyond their skins, spreading their personalities warmly through the room. In this process, the chamber and its furniture grew more and more dignified and luxurious. The shawl hanging at the window took upon itself the richness of tapestry. The brass handles of the chest of drawers were its golden knockers, and the carved bedposts seemed to have some kinship with the magnificent pillars of Solomon's temple. Mrs. Turberfield, having quickly walked hitherward after parting from Tess, opened the front door, crossed the downstairs room, which was in deep gloom, and then unfastened the stair door, like one whose fingers knew the tricks of the latches well. Her ascent of the crooked staircase was a slower process, and her face, as it rose into the light above the last stair, encountered the gaze of all the party assembled in the bedroom. Being a few private friends, I've asked in to keep up club walking at my own expense, the landlady exclaimed, at the sound of footsteps, as glibly as a child repeating the catechism while she peered over the stairs. "Oh, 'tis you, Mrs. Turberfield. Lord, how you frightened me. I thought it might be some gaffer sent by government." Mrs. Turberfield was welcomed with glances and nods by the remainder of the conclave, and turned to where her husband sat. He was humming absently to himself in a low tone. "I be as good as some folks here and there. I've got a family vault at Kingsbere, sub Greenhill, and finer skeletons than any man in the counties o' Wessex. I've got something to tell ye that comes into my head about that. A grand project," whispered his cheerful wife. "Here, John, don't he see me?" She nudged him, while he, looking through her as through a window pane, went on with his recitative. "Hush, don't he sing so loud, my good man," said the landlady, "in case any member of the government should be passing and take away my license." "He's told you what's happened to us, I suppose?" asked Mrs. Turberfield. "Yes, in a way. Do you think coach, even if you don't ride it in. She dropped her public voice and continued in a low tone to her husband. I've been thinking, since you brought the news, that there's a great rich lady out by Tantridge, on the edge of the chase of the name d'Urberville. Nay, what's that? Said Sir John. She repeated the information. That lady must be our relation, she said, and my project is to send Tess to claim kin. There is a lady of the name, now you mention it, said D'Urberville. Parson Tringham didn't think of that. But she's nothing beside we, a junior branch of us, no doubt, long since King Norman's day. While this question was being discussed, neither of the pair noticed, in their preoccupation, that little Abraham had crept into the room and was awaiting an opportunity of asking them to return. She is rich, and she'd be sure to take notice of the maid, continued Mrs. D'Urberville, and 'twill be a very good thing. I don't see why two branches of one family should not be on visiting terms. Yes, and we'll all claim kin, said Abraham brightly from under the bedstead, and we'll all go and see her when Tess has gone to live with her, and we'll ride in her coach and wear black clothes. How do you come here, child? What nonsense be ye talking? Go away and play on the stairs till father and mother be ready. Well, Tess ought to go to this other member of our family. She'd be sure to win the lady, Tess would, and likely enough, 'twould lead to some noble gentleman marrying her. In short, I know it. How? I tried her fate in the fortune teller, and it brought out that very thing. You should have seen how pretty she looked today. Her skin is as supple as a duchess's. What says the maid herself to going? I've not asked her. She don't know there is any such lady relation yet. But it would certainly put her in the way of a grand marriage, and she won't refuse to go. Tess is queer, but she's tractable at bottom. Leave her to me. Though this conversation had been private, sufficient of its import reached the understandings of those around to suggest to them that the D'Urbervilles had weightier concerns to talk of now than common folks had, and that Tess, their pretty eldest daughter, had fine prospects in store. Tess is a fine figure of fun, as I said to myself today when I seed her vamping round parish with the rest, observed one of the elderly boozers in an undertone. But Joan D'Urberville must mind that she don't get green malt in flour. It was a local phrase which had a peculiar meaning, and there was no reply. The conversation became inclusive, and presently other footsteps were heard crossing the room below. Being a few private friends asked in tonight to keep up the club walking at my own expense. The landlady had rapidly reused the formula she kept on hand for intruders before she recognized that the newcomer was Tess. Even to her mother's gaze, the girl's young features looked sadly out of place amid the alcoholic vapors which floated here as no unsuitable medium for wrinkled middle age. And hardly was a reproachful flash from Tess's dark eyes needed to make her father and mother rise from their seats, hastily finish their ale, and descend the stairs behind her, Mrs. Rolliver's caution following their footsteps. No noise, please, if ye'll be so good, my dears, or I may lose my licence, and be summoned, and I don't know what all. Night to ya. They went home together, Tess holding one arm of her father, and Mrs. D'Urberville the other. He had, in truth, drunk very little, not a fourth of the quantity which a systematic tippler could carry to church on a Sunday morning without a hitch of his East smallness of his present residence. I've got a family at Kingsbarre. Hush, don't be so silly, Jackie, said his wife. Yours is not the only family that was of count in old days. Look at the Anktells and the Horaces and the Tringhams themselves. Gone to seed almost as much as you, though you was bigger folks than they, that's true. Thank God I was never of no family, and have nothing to be ashamed of in that way. Don't you be so sure of that. From your nature, 'tis my belief you've disgraced yourselves more than any of us, and was kings and queens outright at one time. Tess turned the subject by saying what was far more prominent in her own mind at the moment than thoughts of her ancestry. I am afraid Father won't be able to take the journey with the beehives tomorrow so early. I shall be all right in an hour or two, said Durbeyfield. It was 11 o'clock before the family were all in bed, and 2 o'clock next morning was the latest hour for starting with the beehives, if they were to be delivered to the retailers in Casterbridge before the Saturday market began. The way thither lying by bad roads over a distance of between 20 and 30 miles, and the horse and wagon being of the slowest. At 1:30, Mrs. Durbeyfield came into the large bedroom where Tess and all her little brothers and sisters slept. The poor man can't go, she said to her eldest daughter, whose great eyes had opened the moment her mother's hand touched the door. Tess sat up in bed, lost in a vague interspace between a dream and this information. But somebody must go, she replied. It is late for the hives already. Swarming will soon be over for the year, and if we put off taking them till next week's market, the call for 'em will be past, and they'll be thrown on our hands. Mrs. Durbeyfield looked unequal to the emergency. Some young feller, perhaps, would go. One of them, who was so much after dancing with ye yesterday, she presently suggested. Oh no, I wouldn't have it for the world, declared Tess proudly, and letting everybody know the reason. Such a thing to be ashamed of. I think I could go, if Abraham could go with me to keep me company. Her mother at length agreed to this arrangement. Little Abraham was roused from his deep sleep in a corner of the same apartment, and made to put on his clothes, while still mentally in the other world. Meanwhile, Tess had hastily dressed herself, and the twain, lighting a lantern, went out to the stable. The rickety little wagon was already laden, and the girl led out the horse, Prince, only a degree less rickety than the vehicle. The poor creature looked wonderingly round at the night, at the lantern, at their two figures, as if he could not believe that at that hour, when every living thing was intended to be at shelter and at rest, he was called upon to go out and labour. They put a stock of candle ends into the lantern, hung the latter up to the off-side of the road, and directed the horse onward, walking at his shoulder at first during the uphill portion of the way, in order not to overload an animal of so little vigour. To cheer themselves as well as they could, they made an artificial morning with the lantern, some bread and butter, and their own conversation, the real morning being far from come. Abraham, as he more fully awake, for he had moved in a sort of trance so far, began to talk of the strange shapes assumed by the various dark objects against the sky, of this tree that looked like a raging tiger springing from a lair, of that which resembled a giant's head. When they had passed the little town of Stowcastle, dumbly somnolent under its thick brown thatch, they reached higher grounds. Still higher on their left, the elevation called Bulbarrow or went gently for a great distance onward. They mounted in front of the wagon, and Abraham grew reflective. Tess, he said, in a preparatory tone, after silence. Yes, Abraham. Paint you glad we've become gentlefolk. Not particular glad. But you be glad that you are going to marry a gentleman. What? Said Tess, lifting her face. 'Tis our great relation, that our great relation will help ye to marry a gentleman. Aye, our great relation. We have no such relation. What has put that into your head? I heard him talking about it up at Rolliver's when I went to find father. There's a rich lady of our family out at Tantridge, and mother said that if you claimed kin with the lady, she'd put in the way of marrying a gentleman. His sister became abruptly still and lapsed into a pondering silence. Abraham talked on, rather for the pleasure of the utterance than for audition, so that his sister's abstraction was of no account. He leaned back against the hives, and, with upturned face, made observations on the stars, whose cold pulses were beating amid the black hollows above, in serene dissociation from these two wisps of human life. He asked how far away these twinklers were, and whether God was on the other side of them. But ever and anon his childish prattle recurred to what impressed his imagination even more deeply than the wonders of creation. If Tess were made rich by marrying a gentleman, would she have money enough to buy a spyglass so large that it would draw the stars as near to her as Nettlecombe Tout? That the renewed subject, which seemed to have impregnated the whole family, filled Tess with impatience. Never mind that now, she exclaimed. Did you say the stars were worlds, Tess? Yes, all like ours. I don't know, but I think so. They sometimes seem to be like the apples on our stubborn tree, most of them splendid and sound, a few blighted. Which do we live on, a splendid one or a blighted one? A blighted one. 'Tis very unlucky that we didn't pitch on a sound one when there were so many more of 'em. Yes. Is it like that really, Tess? Said Abraham, turning to her, much impressed on reconsideration of this rare information. How would it have been if we had pitched on a sound one? Well, father wouldn't have coughed and creeped about as he does, and wouldn't have got too tipsy to go this journey, and mother wouldn't have been always washing and never getting finished. And you would have been a rich lady, ready-made, and not have to be made rich by marrying a gentleman. Oh, Abby, don't talk of that any more. Left to his reflections, Abraham soon grew drowsy. Tess was not skilful in the management of a horse, but she thought that she could take upon herself the entire conduct of the load for the present, and allow Abraham to go to sleep if he wished to do so. She made him a sort of nest in front of the hives, in such a manner that he could not fall, and, taking the rope reins into her own hands, jogged on as before. Prince required but slight attention, lacking energy for superfluous movements of any sort. With no longer a companion to distract her, Tess fell more deeply into reverie than ever. Her back leaning against the hives, the mute procession past her of trees and hedges became attached to a fantastic scene outside reality, and the occasional heave of the wind became the sigh of some immense, sad soul, conterminous with the universe in space and with history in time. Then, examining the mesh of events in her own life, she seemed to see the vanity of her father's pride, the gentlemanly match awaiting herself in her mother's fancy, to see him as a grimacing personage, laughing at her poverty, and her shrouded knightly ancestry. Everything grew more and more extravagant, and she no longer knew how time passed. A sudden jerk shook her in her seat, and Tess awoke from the sleep into which she, too, had fallen. They were a long way farther on than when she had lost consciousness, and the wagon had stopped. A hollow groan, unlike anything she had ever heard in her life, came from the front, followed by a shout of "Hoy there!" The lantern hanging at her wagon had gone out, but another was shining in her face, much brighter than her own had been. Something terrible had happened. The harness was entangled with an object which blocked the way. In consternation, Tess jumped down and discovered the dreadful truth. The groan had proceeded from her father's poor horse, Prince. The morning mail cart, with its two noiseless wheels, speeding along these lanes like an arrow, as it always did, had driven into her slow and unlighted equipage. The pointed shaft of the cart had entered the breast of the unhappy prince like a sword, and from the wound his life's blood was spouting in a stream and falling with a hiss into the road. In her despair, Tess sprang forward and put her hand upon the hole, with the only result that she became splashed from her face to skirt with crimson drops. Then she stood helplessly, looking on. Prince also stood firm and motionless as long as he could, till he suddenly sank down in a heap. By this time, the mail cart man had joined her and began dragging and unharnessing the hugged form of Prince. But he was already dead, and seeing that nothing more could be done immediately, the mail cart man returned to his own animal, which was injured. He was on the wrong side, he said. I am bound to go on with the mail bags, so that the best thing for you to do is to bide here with your load. I'll send somebody to help you as soon as I can. It will soon be daylight, and you have nothing to fear. He mounted and sped on his way, while Tess stood and waited. The atmosphere turned pale. The birds shook themselves in the hedges, arose and twittered. The lane showed all its white features, and Tess showed hers, still whiter. The huge pool of blood in front of her was already assuming the iridescence of coagulation, and when the sun rose, a million prismatic hues were reflected from it. Prince lay alongside, still and stark, his eyes half open, the hole in his chest looking scarcely large enough to have let out all that had animated him. "'Tis all my doing, all mine," the distracted girl cried, gazing intently at the spectacle. "No excuse for me, none. What will father and mother live on now? Abby, Abby," she shook the child, who had slept soundly through the whole disaster. "We can't go on with our load. Prince is killed." When Abraham realized all, the furrows of 50 years were extemporized on his young face. "Why, I danced and laughed only yesterday," she went on to herself, "to think that I was such a fool." "'Tis because we be on a blighted star, and not a sound one, isn't it, Tess?" murmured Abraham through his tears. In stagnant blankness, they waited through an interval which seemed endless. At length, a sound and an approaching object proved to them that the driver of the mail cart had been as good as his word. A farmer's man from near Stour Castle came up, leading a strong cob. He was harnessed to the wagon of beehives in the place of Prince, and the load taken on towards Castor Bridge. The evening of the same day, they saw the empty wagon reach again the spot of the accident. Prince had lain there in the ditch since the morning, but the place of the blood pool was still but visible in the middle of the road, though scratched and scraped over by passing vehicles. All that was left of Prince was now hoisted onto the wagon was in the air, and his shoes shining in the setting sun. He retracted the dozen miles to Marlowe. Tess had gone back earlier. How to break the news was more than she could think. It was a relief to her tongue to find the faces of her parents, that they already knew of their loss, though this did not lessen the self-reproach which she continued to heap upon herself for her negligence in falling asleep. But the very shiftlessness of the household rendered the misfortune a less terrifying one to them than it would have been to a thriving family, though in the present case it meant ruin, and in the other it would have only meant inconvenience. In the D'Urberville countenances there was nothing of the red wrath that had been burnt upon the girl from parents more ambitious for her welfare. Nobody blamed Tess, as she blamed herself. When it was discovered that the knacker and tanner would give only very few shillings for Prince's carcass because of his decrepitude, D'Urberville rose to the occasion. "No," he said stoically, "I won't sell his old body. When we D'Urbervilles was knights in the land, we didn't sell our charges for cat's meat. Let him keep their shillings. He has served me well in his lifetime, and I won't part from him now." He worked harder the next day in digging a grave for Prince in the garden than he had worked for months to grow a crop for his family. When the hole was ready, D'Urberville and his wife tied a rope round the horse and dragged him up to the path towards it, the children following. Abraham and Liza Lou sobbed. Hope and Modesty discharged their griefs in loud blares, which echoed from the walls, and when Prince was tumbled in, they gathered round the grave. The breadwinner had been taken away from them. What would they do? "Is he gone to heaven?" asked Abraham, between the sobs. Then D'Urberville began to shovel in the earth, and the children cried anew, all except Tess. Her face was dry and pale, as though she regarded herself in the light of a murderess. Chapter 5. The higgling business, which had mainly depended on the horse, became disorganized forthwith. Distress, if not penury, loomed in the distance. D'Urberville was what was locally called a slack-twisted fellow. He had good strength to work at times, but none of the times could be relied on to coincide with the hours of requirement, and having been unaccustomed to the regular toil of the day labourer, he was not particularly persistent when they did so coincide. Tess, meanwhile, as the one who had dragged them into this quagmire, was silently wondering what she could do to help them out of it. And then her mother broached her scheme. "We must take the ups with the downs, Tess," said she, "and never could your high blood have been discovered at a more necessary moment. You must try your friends. Do you know that there is a very rich Mrs. D'Urberville living out on the edge of the chase, who must be our relation? You must go to her and clink in and ask for some assistance in our trouble." "I shouldn't care to do that," said Tess. "If there is such a lady, it would be enough for us if she were friendly, not to expect her to give us help." "You could win her round to do anything, my dear. Besides, perhaps there's more in it than you know of. I've heard what I've heard." The oppressive sense of the harm she had done led Tess to be more deferential than she might otherwise have been to the maternal wish. But she could not understand why her mother should find such satisfaction in contemplating an enterprise of, to her, such doubtful profit. Her mother might have made inquiries, and have discovered that this Mrs. D'Urberville was a lady of unequalled virtues and charity. But Tess's pride murmured he. I'm the head of the noblest branch of the family, and I ought to keep myself up. His reasons for staying away were worse to Tess than her own objection to going. Well, as I killed the horse, Mother, she said, mournfully, I suppose I ought to do something. I don't mind going and seeing her, but you must leave it to me about asking for help. And don't go thinking about her making a match for me. It is silly. Very well said, Tess, observed her father, sententiously. Who said I had such a thought? Asked Joan. I fancy it is in your mind, Mother, but I'll go. Rising early next day, she walked to the hill town called Shaston, and there took advantage of a van, which twice in a week ran from Shaston eastward to Chaseborough, passing near Tantridge, the parish in which the vague and mysterious Mrs. d'Urberville had her residence. Tess D'Urberville's route on this memorable morning lay amid the northeastern undulations of the vale in which she had been born, and in which her life had unfolded. The Vale of Blackmoor was to her the world, and its inhabitants the races thereof. From the gates and stiles of Marlow, she had looked down its length in the wondering days of infancy, and what had been mystery to her then was not much less than mystery to her now. She had seen daily from her chamber window towers, villages, faint white mansions. Above all, the town of Shaston, standing majestically on its height, its windows shining like lamps in the evening sun. She had hardly ever visited it, only a small tract, even of the vale and its environs, being known to her by close inspection. Much less had she been far outside the valley. Every contour of the surrounding hills was as personal to her as that of her relatives' faces. But for what lay beyond her judgment was dependent on the teaching of the village school, where she had held a leading place at the time of her leaving, a year or two before this date. In those early days, she had been much loved by others of her own sex and age, and had used to be seen about the village as one of three, all nearly of the same year, walking home from school side by side, Tess being the middle one, in a pink print pinafore of a finely reticulated pattern, worn over a stuff frock that had lost its original colour for a nondescript territory, marching on upon long stalky legs, in tight stockings, which had little ladder-like holes at the knees, torn by kneeling in the roads and banks in search of vegetable and mineral treasures. Her then earth-coloured hair hanging like pothooks, the arms of the two outside girls resting around the waist of Tess, her arms on the shoulders of the two supporters. As Tess grew older and began to see how matters stood, she felt Malthusian vexation with her mother for thoughtlessly giving her so many little sisters and brothers, when it was such trouble to nurse those that had already come. Her mother's intelligence was that of a happy child. Joan d'Urberville was simply an additional one, and that not the eldest, to her own pale, long family of 9, when all were living. However, Tess became humanely beneficent towards the small ones, and to help them as much as possible she used, as soon as she left school, to lend a hand at haymaking or harvesting on neighbouring farms, or by preference at milking or butter-making processes, which she had learnt when her father had owned cows, and being deft-fingered, it was a kind of work in which she excelled. Every representative of the D'Urbervilles at the D'Urberville mansion came as a thing of course. In this instance, it must be admitted that the D'Urbervilles were putting their fairest side onward. She alighted from the van at Tentridge Cross and ascended on foot a hill in the direction of the district known as the Chase, on the borders of which, as she had been informed, Mrs. D'Urberville's seat, the Slopes, would be found. It was not a manorial home in the ordinary sense, with fields and pastures, and a grumbling farmer, out of which a living had to be dragged by the owner and his family, by hook or by crook. It was more, far more, a country house built for enjoyment, pure and simple, and with not an acre of troublesome land attached to it beyond what was required for residential purposes, and a little fancy farm kept in hand by the owner and tended by a bailiff. The warm red brick lodge came first in sight, up to its eaves in dense evergreens. Tess thought this was the mansion itself, till, passing through the side wicket with some trepidation, and onward to a point at which the drive took a turn, the house proper stood in full view. It was of recent erection, indeed almost new, and of the same rich crimson colour that formed such contrast with the evergreens of the lodge. Far behind the bright brick corner of the house, which rose like a red geranium against the subdued colours around, stretched the soft azure landscape of the Chase, a truly venerable tract of forest land, one of the few remaining woodlands in England of undoubted primeval date, wherein judicial mistletoe was still found on aged oaks, and where enormous yew trees, not planted by the hand of man, had grown when they had pollarded for bows. All this sylvan antiquity, however, though visible from the slopes, was outside the immediate boundaries of the estate. Everything on this snug property was bright, thriving, and well kept. Acres of glass houses stretched down the inclines to the copses at their feet. Everything looked like money, like the last coin issued from the mint. The stables, partly screened by Austrian pines and evergreen oaks, and fitted with every late appliance, were as dignified as chapels of ease, and on the extensive lawn stood an ornamental tent, its door being towards her. Simple Tess D'Urberville stood at gaze in a half-paralysed attitude on the edge of the gravel sweep. Her feet had brought her onward to this point before she had quite realised where she was, and now all was contrary to her expectation. "I thought we were an old family, but this is all new," she said, in her girlish artlessness. She wished she had not fallen in so readily with her mother's plans for claiming kin, and had endeavoured to gain assistance nearer home. The D'Urbervilles, or Stock D'Urbervilles, as they'd first called themselves, who owned all this, were a somewhat unusual family to find in such an old-fashioned part of the country. Parson Tringham had spoken truly when he said that our shambling John D'Urberville was the only really lineal representative of the old D'Urberville family existing in the county, or near it. He might have added what he knew very well, that the Stoke D'Urbervilles were no more D'Urbervilles of the true tree than he was himself. Yet it must be admitted that this family formed a very good stock, whereon to regraft a name which sadly wanted such renovation. When old Mr. Simon Stoke, latterly deceased, honest merchant, some say moneylender, in the north, he decided to settle as a county man in the south of England, out of hail of his business district, and in doing this, he felt the necessity of recommencing with a name not quite so well remembered there, and less commonplace than the two original bold Stark words. Conning for an hour in the British Museum, the pages of works devoted to extinct, half-extinct, obscured and ruined families appertaining to the quarter of England in which he proposed to settle, he considered that d'Urberville looked and sounded as well as any of them, and d'Urberville accordingly was annexed to his own name for himself and his heirs eternally. Yet he was not an extravagant-minded man in this, and in constructing his family tree on the new basis, was reasonable in framing his intermarriages and connecting links, never inserting a single title above a rank of strict moderation. Of this work of imagination, poor Tess and her parents were naturally in ignorance, much to their own discomfiture. Indeed, the very possibility of such annexations was unknown to them, who supposed that, though to be well favoured might be the gift of fortune, a family name came by nature. Tess still stood hesitating, like a bather about to make a plunge, hardly knowing whether to retreat or to persevere, when a figure came forth from the dark, triangular door of the tent. It was that of a tall, young man, smoking. He had an almost swarthy complexion, with full lips, badly moulded, though red and smooth, above which was a well-groomed black moustache with curled points, though his age could not be more than 3 or 24. Despite the touches of barbarism in his contours, there was a singular force in the gentleman's face, and in his bold, rolling eye. "Well, my big beauty, what can I do for you?" said he, coming forward, and perceiving that she stood quite confounded. "Never mind me. I am Mr. d'Urberville. Have you come to see me or my mother?" This embodiment of a d'Urberville and a namesake differed even more from what Tess had expected than the house and grounds had differed. She had dreamed of an aged and dignified face, the sublimation of all distinctively d'Urberville's lineaments, furrowed with incarnated memories, representing in hieroglyphic the centuries of her family and England's history. But she screwed herself up to the work in hand, since she could not get out of it, and answered, "I came to see your mother, sir." "I am afraid you cannot see her. She is an invalid," replied the present representative of the spurious house. For this was Mr. Alec, the only son of the lately deceased gentleman. "Cannot I answer your purpose? What is the business you wish to see her about?" "It isn't business. It is, I can hardly say what. Pleasure." "Oh no. Why, sir, if I tell you, it will seem—" Tess's sense of a certain ludicrousness in her errand was now so strong that, notwithstanding her awe of him and her general discomfort at being here, her rosy lips curved towards a smile, much to the attraction of the swarthy Alexander. "It is so very foolish," she stammered. "I fear I can't tell you." "Never mind. I like foolish things. Try again, my dear," said he kindly. "Mother asked me to come," Tess continued, "and indeed Castle Ardent is certainly my crest, said he blandly. And so Mother said we ought to make ourselves be known to you, as we've lost our horse by an accident, and are the oldest branch of the family. Very kind of your mother, I'm sure, and I, for one, don't regret her step. Alec looked at Tess as he spoke, in a way that made her blush a little. And so, my pretty girl, you've come on a friendly visit to us relations. I suppose I have, faltered Tess, looking uncomfortably at the mansion. Well, there's no harm in it. Where do you live? What are you? She gave him brief particulars, and, after further inquiries, told him that she was intending to go back by the same carrier who had brought her. It is a long while before he returns past Tenthridge Cross. Supposing we walk round the grounds to pass the time, my pretty coz. Tess wished to abridge her visit as much as possible, but the young man was pressing, and she consented to accompany him. He conducted her about the lawns and flower beds and conservatories, and thence to the fruit garden, where he asked her if she liked strawberries. Yes, said Tess, when they come. They are already here. D'Urberville began gathering specimens of the fruit for her, handing them back to her as he stooped, and presently selecting a specially fine product of the British Queen variety. He stood up and held it by the stem to her mouth. No, no, she said quickly, putting her fingers between his hand and her lips. I would rather take it in my own hand. Nonsense, he insisted, and in a slight distress, she parted her lips and took it in. They had spent some time wandering desultorily, thus Tess eating in an abstract, half-hypnotized state, whatever D'Urberville offered her. When she could consume no more of the strawberries, he filled her little basket with them, and then the two passed round to the rose trees, whence he gathered blossoms and gave her to put in her bosom. She obeyed, still like one in a dream, and when she could affix her no more, he himself tucked a bud or two into her hat, and heaped her basket with others in the prodigality of his bounty. At last, looking at his watch, he said, Now, by the time you have had something to eat, it will be time for you to leave, if you want to catch the carrier to Shaston. Come here, and I'll see what grub I can find. Stoke D'Urberville took her back to the lawn, and into the tent where he left her, soon reappearing with a basket of light luncheon, which he put before her himself. It was evidently the gentleman's wish not to be disturbed in this pleasant tete-a-tete by the servantry. Do you mind my smoking? He asked. Oh, not at all, sir. He watched her pretty and unconscious munching through the skeins of smoke that pervaded the tent, and Tess D'Urberville did not divine, as she innocently looked down at the roses in her bosom, that there behind the blue narcotic haze sat the tragic mischief of her drama, he who was to be the blood-red ray in the spectrum of her young life. She had an attribute which amounted to a disadvantage just now, and it was this that caused Alec D'Urberville's eyes to rivet themselves upon her. It was a luxuriance of aspect, fullness of growth, which made her appear more of a woman than she really was. She had inherited the feature of her mother without the quality it denoted. It had troubled her mind occasionally, till her companions had said that it was a fault which time could cure. She soon had finished her lunch. Now, I am going home, sir, she said, rising. And what do they call you? he asked, as he accompanied her along the drive till they were out of sight of the house. Tess D'Urberville, down at Marlow. And you say your people have lost their horse? I killed him, she answered, her eyes filling with tears as she gave particulars of Prince's death. I don't know what to do for father on account of it. I must think if I cannot do something. My mother must find a berth for you. But Tess, no nonsense about D'Urberville, only, quite another name. I wish for no better, sir, said she, with something of dignity. For a moment, only for a moment, when they were in the turning of the drive between the tall rhododendrons and conifers, before the lodge became visible, he inclined his face towards her, as if. But no, he thought better of it, and let her go. Thus the thing began. Had she perceived this meeting's import, she might have asked why she was doomed to be seen and marked and coveted that day by the wrong man, and not by a certain other man, the exact and true one in all respects, as nearly as human mutuality can be exact and true. Yet, to him at this time, she was but a transient impression half forgotten. In the ill-judged execution of the well-judged plan of things, the call seldom produces the comer. The man to love rarely coincides with the hours for loving. Nature does not often say, see, to her poor creature at a time when seeing can lead to happy doing, or reply here to a body's cry of where. To hide and seek has become an irksome, outworn game. We may wonder whether at the acme and summit of the human progress, these anachronisms will become corrected by a finer intuition and closer interaction of the social machinery than that which now jolts us round and along. But such completeness is not to be prophesied, or even conceived as possible. Even enough that, in the present case, as in millions, the two halves of an approximately perfect whole did not confront each other at the perfect moment. Part and counterpart wandered independently about the earth in the stupidest manner for a while, till the late time came, out of which maladroit delay sprang anxieties, disappointments, shocks, catastrophes, what was called a strange destiny. When D'Urberville got back to the tent, he sat down astride on a chair reflecting, with a pleased gleam in his face,